Hello, I'm Andy Oliver, the Minister of Pastoral Care at Portland First United Methodist Church. Today's devotional is really focusing in on the life at Portland First United Methodist Church. If you're watching this and are not a part of our specific faith community, perhaps there's something here that could relate to some of the groups that you're involved with. Back in May of 2020, George Floyd was murdered by some police officers. This kicked off a new round of anti racism and advocacy action. At the time, a member of Portland First UMC asked me, "Why do you think there's so many white people who all of a sudden care about racism?" I think it's a good question. I think there might have been many reasons why a larger number of white people became more vocal at that point in history. For one, a lot of us had time in our hands, and we were forced by the COVID pandemic quarantine to slow down and pay attention to the social sickness of racism. As we have come out of quarantine, I do not hear as much about racial inequity as I did in the summer of 2020. Our unseen benefit of white privilege was revealed in light of the horrific violence inflicted upon Mr. Floyd by the police officers. I don't know very many white people, at least not wealthy ones, who have been treated by the police with such murderous disregard. And yet we hear very clearly the testimony of countless voices for black, brown, indigenous people of police racism, which is, of course, merely a smaller outward reflection of the quieter systemic racism in our larger culture. So Portland First United Methodist Church has this opportunity at great cost of painful suffering upon people of color to look more honestly about our own racism, both as individuals, as a church community, and as a member of the larger community here in Portland. There are many reasons for doing this, and if you need some directions, reach out to me or some other people in the church. I think our specific congregation has a particular challenge when it comes to racism because we believe we're not racist. And I'm not simply talking about the fact that it's very rare for a white person to believe they're racist and to come out and claim it. For example, there was a football coach who was recently fired because of, among other things, racist comments he made in earlier communication. In submitting his resignation statement, he said, "I'm not a racist." Well, isn't that just silly and false? If it talks like a duck and walks like a duck, at what point do we say, it's a duck? How is it that a person can say racist things but not be a racist? Or on a larger scale, if one looks at social factors, everything from home ownership to wealth accumulation, to percentages of people incarcerated, to the presence of diabetes or hypertension, to percentages of people in leadership positions in churches and politics and military and businesses, to infant death and birth mortality, to all sorts of social indicators of health and welfare, Black, indigenous, and people of color are simply not allowed to thrive in the way that white people are, and the statistics bear it out. And yet, apparently, there are no white racists if you listen to white people tell the story, which, of course, we're allowed to do if one looks at media ownership and management and so forth. So, yes, white people like myself, we do claim innocence and purity when it comes to racism. But racism for progressive Christians is especially difficult to root out because we think progressives can't be racist. Whatever progressive Christianity means, if we think we are anti-racist, then we must automatically not be a racist. There are several ways racism can be expressed. One is through statements or actions regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized racial group. Let me give an example. A few years ago, one of my neighbors was a black woman. One day, we both show up at the same time to get our meal. She's wearing surgical scrubs like you see people wear in hospitals. And I ask, "Oh, are you a nurse?" Why would I assume she's a nurse and not a doctor? Nurses and doctors are both important. Doctors have to go through more rigorous training and more extensive education than nurses. Certainly her gender could play a role, but I also think her race played a role. In my mind, even though I did not intend to, my first instinct was to assess her as a black woman and thus did not initially consider her as someone who would be a doctor. All of this took place in my mind in a flash without me even ever being aware that it was happening. And of course, how she receives this has nothing to do with my intentions. That is the thing about racism. It's not dependent upon what the white person intends. Rather, it depends upon the impact of the statement or action upon the recipient. Now, one might slough off a single off-the-cuff comment. But what if this woman all day long, every day, is assessed by white people and put into limiting categories? She can be a nurse, but not a doctor. According to black people, this happens all the time. So I think racism is bad, and I'm also a racist. It's possible to do and be both at the same time. Here's a statement I heard about white privilege. Privilege is not something I take, and which I therefore have the option of not taking. Privilege is something that society gives to me, and unless I change the institutions which give it to me, they will continue to give it, and I will continue to have it, however noble and egalitarian my intentions. Christians are called to tell the truth. Both I and our church need to continue to do the necessary work, the hard, painful, necessary work of revealing racism and interrupting and changing the privilege we receive because of it, especially because we don't think we have to. We need to tell the truth about our racisms to stop the harm we are causing others. Thank you.